Okay. All right, come on up here.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Hey. As some of you know, I'm David Getty, and this is my partner in rhyme, Weston Gaylord. And we are here to welcome you to our evening of rowdy recitation. I think you've got the idea already. That's good. And you know, we're going to attempt to party like it's 1909. Let's see, yeah. But before we start, I'd like to make a big thank you to Capital Cider, to Julie Tall, the owner, who unfortunately can't be here tonight because she's not feeling well, but to John and Jen behind the bar, who have both done amazing things to help us get set up and make all this stuff work. I'd like to also recognize a number of people who've come from such a long way away. I've got family from Australia right down here. If you haven't met Lynn and Adam, please introduce yourself at the intermission. But we've also got people who've flown in from Austin, somewhere over there. And Hood River, and Berkeley here, yay Berkeley, and Denver. Okay, so somehow you know something about this evening that we don't. So, having said that, I'm going to turn it over to Weston, my collaborator, who's going to actually explain what the hell we're doing here tonight.
Yeah, thanks, David. So we're just going to give, before we jump in, a little bit of context to what it is we're doing here and what the tradition is that this is coming out of. So tonight is all about narrative verse. So anybody who has come in from downstairs is probably really excited right now. Narrative verse, meaning storytelling with some rhythm and a little bit of rhyme. It has a very long history, which is much too deep for us to really get into tonight. But suffice to say, it is an oral tradition that has its roots in pretty much every human culture, from the Iliad and the Odyssey to the Vietnamese Tale of Q with 3,200 verses, to the medieval Canterbury Tales and many more things. What they have in common is they tell a story, and they often have a very strict, rigid rhyme scheme or meter or epithets and alliteration, because those are things that make them easy to remember and easy to recite. And so those recitations become entertainment. By the early 19th century, you have people gathering to hear things like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And by the beginning of the 19th century, poems like Casey at the Bat, which you might have heard, have been standard evening entertainment. In fact, let's hear a little bit of that, just as a flavor.
And now the leather-covered sphere comes hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by the sturdy batsman, the ball unheeded sped. That ain't my style, said Casey. Strike one, the umpire said. As you might have guessed, things did not end well for Casey and the Mudville Nine that day. But that particular poem was so popular and so recited at the turn of the 20th century that really people were getting sick of it. And in the Yukon Territory of Canada, a British-Canadian guy by the name of Robert W. Service decided he was going to write some poems that were going to be just as successful as Casey at the Bat, but with a local flair. Here's a little taste of the cremation of Sam McGee, one of his more famous ones.
And I'm Canadian. We had to memorize it.
There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold, and the Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge, where I cremated Sam McGee. At the same time, down in Australia, Banjo Patterson was extolling the virtues of rural life with The Man from Snowy River, or so-called bush ballads like the Jibung Polo Club.
It was somewhere up the country, in a land of rock and scrub, that they formed an institution called the Jibung Polo Club. They were long and wiry natives from the rugged mountainside, and the horse was never saddled that the Jibungs couldn't ride. But their style of playing polo was irregular and rash. They had mighty little science and a mighty lot of dash. I grew up in rural Australia, not far actually from Snowy River country, and it was just a standard thing for kids in schools to learn some of these Banjo Paterson ballads, and I think I started my love for this thing by learning those when I was a kid. That skill turned out to be very successful for me in America when I came over here, because certain people, especially my dear wife Chris, seemed to like hearing them, and she jokes that I wooed her with Banjo Paterson.
Similarly, I grew up memorizing poems like Poe's The Raven and Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky when I was in school, but really got imprinted on during camping trips when I was growing up, including some camping trips with David, where people would pull out these ballads that they had memorized somewhere out in the woods, in the wilderness, on a backpacking trip around a campfire. That's really where they are best. So, you know, some of the classic works like the ones we've just teased will hopefully stay in the canon with us for a long time, but that's not what tonight is about. Tonight, David and I have made a humble attempt to add a few new entries to the canon. Yeah. So, what you're going to hear tonight are two new original non-fiction stories written in ballad form. And just by basically pure chance, David and I wrote these independently, but we both chose to dramatize events from the early 20th century, just before the First World War. And in fact, both ballads are about long and ill-advised journeys. We're only sharing these two ballads tonight because, like the long and ill-advised journeys they describe, they are long and epic in scope. So maybe it will feel a bit like you're coming on those journeys with us.
So Weston will start, and I will do a bit of clean-up batter, I guess, if that's the right analogy in baseball. But we'll have an intermission, and then our friend Hank Lemon over here, a well-known musician, but well-known well beyond Seattle, is going to come and play a little music, some from the period and some of his own creation. All right, take it away, Weston.
All right. Before I start here, I'm just going to give just a quick word. Oh, yes. Thank you. Just a quick word about my poem before I start here. It's called The River of Doubt. It is about the 1913 Roosevelt-Rondon Brazilian River expedition. And it is written in a very, as most ballads have, a very rigid and strict format. So I just wanted to get you acquainted to that before we jump in. Some of the ballads that David and I quoted earlier often come in stanzas of 4 lines. Mine has 5. It's one bigger. And it has a very specific rhyme scheme and meter, which I'll just give you a taste of here. This is the first stanza. There's a yarn too rarely spun of a Roosevelt and son who arranged an expedition 1914 thereabout. 19 strong the day they left, but returning 3 bereft, for their travel would unravel as they forged that fateful route through the jungles of Brazil along that river named for Doubt. So that's the format that I'm working in here. It might take a little bit of time to adjust to the 5-line meter, but settle in and enjoy the story. I think it'll take about 30 minutes, and there'll be a few accompanying photos, some of which were actually taken on the expedition. So without further ado. the River of Doubt. There's a yarn too rarely spun of a Roosevelt and son who arranged an expedition 1914 thereabout. 19 strong the day they left, but returning 3 bereft, for their travel would unravel as they forged that fateful route through the jungles of Brazil along that river named for Doubt. Their departure was auspicious and the outlook seemed propitious, and yet all too soon arose a host of hazards to be skirted. As the tribulations grew, they nearly overwhelmed the crew, 3 of whom would meet their doom and find disaster unaverted. 1 was drowned, another murdered, and the murderer deserted. But let us not proceed before we give a nod to Theodore, he whose granite-carven face adorns a North Dakotan hill, honored veteran of wars, lover of the great outdoors, one so peerless in his fearlessness and appetite for thrill that he lingers in our national imagination still. Teddy craved a change of pace. He'd lost a presidential race, despite triumphantly orating with a bullet in his chest, so he fidgeted and fussed, fairly racked with wanderlust, his adoring wife imploring that he get some needed rest when he got an invitation to Brazil as honored guest. It was quite the tempting lure, an extended speaking tour near his son and scion Kermit, who had found a new position building bridges in Bahia. It would be a panacea for his stress. He answered yes without a moment's indecision, knowing well he'd get no better chance to fund an expedition. With his signature aplomb, he dispatched one Father Zom, evolutionist and priest, a contradiction of a man, who had long urged Teddy on to explore the Amazon. "Now's your time," said Teddy. "I'm assuming since you're such a fan of South America, you'll join the team and draft my travel plan?" "No problemo," said the padre. "I will rustle up a cadre of the saltiest surveyors I can find to come along. Make logistical decisions, stock the larder with provisions, whilst ensuring we're securing riverboats both light and strong, and that the course is safely studied. What could possibly go wrong?" True, the route that Zom intended likely would have proven splendid. Amazon to Rio Negro, Orinoco to the sea, scenic sites that would amaze, well-established waterways, free of stress, a sure success, and yet that trip was not to be. As for how their plans diverted, you will find out presently. Meanwhile, in Bahia's port, thin mustachio athwart his lip, was waiting Kermit Roosevelt to join his father's corps, bursting with poetic thought, Harvard man and polyglot, ever burning with a yearning for his distant paramour, with his penned proposal pending, Kermit brooded on the shore. One thing lingered to decide. Roosevelt would need a guide who could act as co-commander. He would not succeed alone. The Brazilians suggested one who'd suffered through and tested every horror, an explorer whose resolve was widely known throughout the country, and his name was Colonel Cândido Rondon. Now, this Cândido Rondon was a man the winds had blown into poverty and struggle, loneliness and opposition, and emerged a seasoned player, hardened soldier and surveyor. He agreed, "I'll come and lead you on this pioneering mission, just so long as it will be a useful mapping expedition." "I declare Rondon is right. The route that Zom proposed is trite," Teddy growled, "distinctly safe, already studied. Why should I, with my one trip to Brazil, not attempt a greater thrill, swap the sterile for true peril, make discoveries thereby?" And a voice said, "Teddy, why not give the duvida a try? If you're really so concerned that you leave no stone unturned," an advisor now put forth, "the river Doubt's an unturned stone. It is such a rugged course just to reach the river's source. Every guide who's ever tried has failed. There's just one man alone who has reached it and returned. His name is Cândido Rondon." Years before, Rondon had led a corps of soldiers to the head of a large uncharted river which had caused him due concern. By that time, his men were fried, overtired, and ill-supplied, and defeated, they retreated. Thus the river came to earn the name of Doubt, and thus Rondon did vow that one day he'd return. So our team commenced to chart an altered course. They would depart from the state of Mato Grosso with a mule train overland toward the lonely frontier town of Utiarity and down into the basin where they'd hasten to identify a strand of the river's upper reaches, then put in canoes as planned. Teddy swiftly got an earful from his sponsors, who were fearful that this new and thrilling route would prove calamitous instead. No one knows the river's length or its current's speed and strength. We will not accept a jot of liability, they said, should it come to pass that you and your companions wind up dead. Yet these warnings held no weight, for Teddy sought to emulate all those Golden Age explorers whose resilience he shared, those insane, intrepid souls who risked their lives to reach the poles, scaling peaks with frostbit cheeks, facing death with cuspids bared. Be this trip my last, responded Roosevelt. I am prepared. Thus it was their plans were changed, and the team's reactions ranged from delight to apprehension, or in Zom's case, discontent, for the course recalculation meant his careful preparation now was moot, his efforts fruitless, all the funding wrongly spent on massive motorboats that would not fit the river if they went. With astute anticipation, they dispatched a delegation led by one named Pyreneus, whom Rondon did nominate, to attempt to reach a spot on the Madeira where he thought the River Doubt might empty out. There his company would wait for the major expedition and would help them exfiltrate. Both Rondon and Roosevelt, from their first acquaintance, felt instant kinship, each respectful of the other's stalwart past. Kermit's eagerness was less, for his bell had answered yes. Still he stayed, in part afraid the trip would prove his father's last. They embarked in early January, thus the die was cast. Now our pioneers and fools, with their oxen and their mules, crossed the vast Brazilian highlands, a Precambrian plateau strewn with mule bones by the score, while those who tried and failed before lingered ghostly in the mostly empty plains and urged, "Don't go." Very quickly, hunger proved itself to be their greatest foe. Per the colonel's solemn orders, from the leaders to the porters, everybody skipped the midday luncheon, strictly mandatory. Dinner was a huge event, nothing less than heaven sent. As they ate together gratefully, each man would tell a story, out-embellishing the one before with claims of grit and glory. As they came to Utiarity, the imminent severity of resource management became a sudden grave concern. For the trip had grown too full. It meant that some would bite the bullet, play the Roman journey home, and so respectfully adjourn. Several volunteered, and Zom was asked politely to return. They pushed on through endless trees, hills of ants, eye-licker bees. Kermit Roosevelt's malaria was hanging on like hell, and they came to realize they'd have to cast off more supplies, therefore hence with half the tents. Imagine how their faces fell when they learned that each man's luggage would be cut in half as well. Soon the crew became aware of a sharp, unblinking stare. The Nambiquara tribe was watching, hidden cautious in the fen. They knew Rondon. He'd once forged peace, made their flights of arrows cease by playing Wagner. They, agog, began to trust his goodwill then. Die if you must, but never kill, Rondon commanded of his men. The tribe respected him thenceforth, and as our heroes bushwhacked north, the Nambiquara let them pass, a show of diplomatic grace. But they cast off so much weight, Rondon began to calculate, just to feed the men they'd need to have the rations in a race between the scarceness of provisions and the swiftness of their pace. After 2 months of such trials, they had trekked 400 miles. Now they reached the marshy basin at their chosen river's throat, where a crisis did arise. As Zom had slimmed down their supplies, it seemed that he had blithely deprioritized the need to float. They had reached the river's head without a single goddamn boat. The motorboats and light canoes they'd been far too quick to lose. Now they purchased 7 dugouts from a tribe that lived nearby. Heavy, clumsy, hard to steer. Roosevelt had much to fear from this approach, but didn't broach the subject. They would have to try. It was onward with the dugouts down the river, or they'd die. Ever since he was a child, Teddy'd hungered for the wild, ever drawn to mortal danger and by reckless dreams ensnared. Yet by river's edge he felt for just a flash, un-Roosevelt. Sensed a pall where he had always laughed before and never cared. For the first time, Teddy Roosevelt felt doubtful, unprepared. It took half a day to lug out 7 stubborn wooden dugouts to the riverbank, and even then no cause to celebrate. 1 too small, another creaky, 2 were waterlogged and leaky, and the rest were yet untested, but they had no time to wait. So they started down the river, leaving all the rest to fate. They affixed the weaker crafts into stable balsa rafts, wooden edges nearly level with the water from their fill, creeping forward down the river. Now they noticed with a shiver, eerie calm, each draping palm looked down on water much too still, and the jungle strangely silent, save a rare exotic trill. In Teddy Roosevelt's canoe was a camarada who was known as Julio de Lima. With a reputation grim, he'd attacked a fellow man just before the trip began. Now he sat with wide-brimmed hat and steered the boat with brawny limb, and if his eyes betrayed emotion, they were hidden by the brim. To the discontent of all, they were moving at a crawl, for Rondon demanded every survey map be triple-checked. Like a finely tuned machine, he kept a daily strict routine, up at 5 to take a dive, and then in uniform bedecked, gave the day's instructions while the boat stood ready to inspect. It was just 2 days before they spotted something on the shore, hints of thatch, a wall of mud, a shard of pot atop a midden. Once a village, now forgotten, overgrown with vines and rotten, looking gaunt and somewhat haunted, like a sacred place forbidden. And they knew the Nambiquara were nearby, observing, hidden. Now the men were filled with dread at the sound they heard ahead, roaring rapids fast approaching from around the river bend. They could portage and lose speed, or risk the rapids and proceed, but maybe lose a few canoes, and Rondon did not intend to jeopardize the expedition for a doubtful dividend. Sweating, insect-plagued and sore, they hauled the boats up on the shore, soaked and sodden, filled with splinters, and, to move them over ground, laid down logs to bear the load until they formed a rolling road, a spirit-breaking undertaking, toward the edge of patience bound, for it took them nearly 3 full days to bring the boats around. But no sooner had the crew lowered in the last canoe and proceeded down the river than they heard the sound again, that foreboding splashing roar, which meant they'd have to go ashore and repeat the awful feat to portage every boat, and when they'd finished, put back in and hope to God for calmer water then. The second portage seemed accursed, twice as nasty as the first. As they rolled it over logs, the largest dugout slipped and cracked, and their campsite was oppressed by a nearby termite nest, whose eager occupants did flock the tents and on their clothing snacked. Teddy woke to find his underclothes 1 leg of Long John lacked. Ergo, when Rondon now heard they were approaching yet a third, he knew well another portage would be fatal for morale. We'll unload the food, he said, and portage only that instead. Then, fingers crossed, no boat is lost. Ride the rapids through we shall. Risk the rafts, but not the rations, was his reasoned rationale. But their luck was on the fritz. 2 canoes were dashed to bits as they scrambled to protect the rest from being swept away. Teddy Roosevelt, he eyed his son's initiative with pride. Kermit thrived and came alive in times of crisis and dismay. In the end, they saved 5 boats, but feared the cost of the delay. Later, even as they slept, 2 more balsa rafts were swept away downstream. That's 4 canoes, a fatal fraction of the fleet. 2 they salvaged, 2 were smashed, so their highest hopes were dashed. Rotten luck, the men were stuck. They could not move on or retreat. They would have to camp and wait until new dugouts were complete. While the men set up the tents, the camaradas did commence to construct a huge new dugout, an immense amount of work. It did not take long to build, for they were diligent and skilled and quite adept, that is, except the man de Lima, who would shirk, often skulking on the sidelines with a crooked little smirk. Soon the dugout was completed, and with Teddy firmly seated in the bow of the canoe, the expedition moved once more. For a change, their good luck held. All the rapids had been quelled, and when they eyed the riverside, they saw no dangers on the shore. Roosevelt relaxed, and so returned their esprit de corps. Yet each time they chanced to guess their troubles might be growing less, every time their fears abated and their hopes ascended higher, some new hardship would arise, just as if to say, "Surprise! You should have kenned the river bend would lead to something rather dire. I can see you've tried the frying pan, but have you met the fire?" One March day, the colonel saw another rapid's foaming maw, told his men to hold position, and he went ashore to scout. Kermit tried his best to chill, but the man could not sit still for all the earth. To prove his worth, he coaxed his men to paddle out, spied the waterfall, and saw what all the fuss had been about. Streaks of fear ran through his marrow. He was with his dog, Triguero, and the paddlers, Simplicio and Joao, all swept away. Joao reached the riverbank while the others nearly sank, then like dolls rode down the falls. The brave Triguero was okay, and he barked to warn the others to bring help without delay. "Splendid bath?" Rondon asked, curt, albeit pleased he'd not been hurt. Kermit nodded. He was happy to be back on solid ground. Teddy hugged his son with joy, relieved that fate had spared the boy. Then they heard a cry that stirred them from their merriment, the sound of Joao yelling with the message that Simplicio had drowned. Thus the journey took its toll on the first unlucky soul of the trio who were destined to depart the mortal plane. So they buried his poor bones, built a cairn of river stones, and floated on. The day half gone, they had momentum to maintain. Teddy vowed he'd never let his son so near to death again. In a fortnight, they'd progressed 90 measly miles at best, with a deficit of dugouts and the rations 1/3 spent. While Rondon conferred with Teddy, "Our supplies are low already, and I fear the route from here may span a monstrous extent, maybe 4 or 5 times farther." Teddy said, "Let's pitch a tent." Now Rondon did venture out with his trusted dog to scout for a clearing they could camp in, somewhere safe within the glade. Then he heard the dying pleas of some creature through the trees, and promptly found his faithful hound upon the ground with limbs all splayed. But the arrows in his side were not by Nambiquara made. Even to the great Rondon, this new tribe's nature was unknown. All their arrows were equipped with barbs and nearly spanned 5 feet. Seeing now the dog was dead, Rondon was pierced with awful dread at the thought that there was not a safe way out. If they should meet the land's inhabitants on warlike terms, there could be no retreat. Yet for all the luck they lacked, they continued unattacked, until the weary expedition to a tributary came, which confirmed the river Doubt was a waterway of clout, thus repaying their surveying with a major find to claim. Hence the river was rechristened by Rondon in Teddy's name. Now it was the Roosevelt, but still a gripping doubt they felt that their party would be doomed to never reach the river's end. Of the secret tribe, some traces could be seen, but not their faces. They decided they would hide themselves, it seemed. So to extend a sign of amity, Rondon left gifts to mark himself a friend. Finding what Rondon had left, near invisible and deft, the native Cinta Larga people watched the boats from shrouded posts. They were skillful forest rangers, with the river's many dangers well acquainted, yet untainted by the world and all its hosts of pale imperial adventurers who seemed to them as ghosts. The Cinta Larga had waged war upon their neighbor tribes before, just to satisfy a vengeance or protect against a coup. Now they held a grave convention to determine their intention toward these odd and pallid bodies that were loudly passing through, but whose nature was uncertain. They debated what to do. All the while, Rondon had found a better place to come aground, thickly planted with the dugout-building trees that they would need. So construction resumed while Teddy paced the bank and fumed. He was restive and possessed of an impatience at their speed, which he worried that the colonel had a reason to impede. Justified in his concern, Teddy shortly came to learn that Rondon had told the men to slow the work, for in his view, it was only by delaying that they'd finish the surveying, which without the River Doubt would stay unmapped. Yet Teddy knew every day that passed endangered the survival of the crew. On they floated, still afraid that from any darkened glade might fly 5-foot arrows from some native archer's poisoned quiver. Unassailed, they worried yet of the even sterner threat of malaria, the scare of which was felt with every shiver. Gulping quinine, swatting ants, the men continued down the river. Just when luck was what they needed, still misfortune interceded. As they portaged the canoes one afternoon, a dugout slipped and was quickly trapped beneath the water. Teddy grit his teeth and made a charge to save the barge, diving in with passion gripped. They retrieved the boat, but Roosevelt's right shin was deeply ripped. Soon the open gash ballooned into a dark and swollen wound. As he lay beneath a lean-to, Teddy felt the touch of chill, the portentous gentle cold of infection taking hold. He was sapped of all his aptitude, irrevocably ill, and he found himself too weak to stand, this man of mythic will. They continued their progression in a quiet, grave procession. All men walked along the bank except for Teddy, who lay prone in the dugout, ghostly seeming, trapped within his fever dreaming, softly uttering grim mutterings in raspy monotone. Roosevelt was now traversing through some country all his own. Now the expedition met the crucial barrier, a set of 6 high waterfalls on steep embankments lurking just ahead. They could not float safely through, and neither portage a canoe. Fate would force them toward a course that filled each man with gnawing dread. Ditch the boats, proceed on foot, and so leave Roosevelt for dead. There was obdurate division on this difficult decision. Few were game to press on, knowing he would likely not pull through. At this juncture, Teddy went and summoned Kermit to his tent and whispered, "Son, do not save one at the expense of all the crew. I've a bottle full of morphine, Kermit. You know what to do." Then the bull moose fixed his air with a dark, determined stare, somewhere deep within the jungle where no light pollutes the sky, and he urged his son to act, save himself and seal the pact. Kermit Roosevelt, God knows he felt his own demise was nigh, yet he took the bottle, steeled his nerves, and growled, "You will not die." Kermit spoke with all the fire and stubborn courage of his sire, who acknowledged it was folly to resist his son's demand. Now the only way to get his son home safely was to let himself be saved. So Teddy caved, and with a pale and shaking hand, took a hold of Kermit's shoulder and did will himself to stand. Clutching ever-shrinking hopes, they lowered down the boats with ropes, past the waterfalls and thence into the jungle deeper drove, till a paddler named Paichon, a certain favorite of Rondon, who once had worn his trousers torn to shreds so long and hard he strove, now in horror caught Delima stealing rations from the trove. But Delima, sans remorse, seemed to dare a show of force, for he knew the men so few they would not harm him. He was smart. Yet the standoff ended soon, for that very afternoon Paichon, emboldened, sharply scolded him for shirking in his part, so Delima raised a rifle, aimed, and shot him through the heart. Rondon and Teddy, both nearby, heard a gunshot and a cry, and they sprinted toward the sound to find a scene of awful gore. Paichon's poor body in the mud, the riverbank awash with blood, a sandal's tread of one who'd fled into the jungle, and, what's more, cast in haste into the bushes, was Delima's .44. Both men reeling from the deed, the commanders disagreed. Teddy vowed to kill Delima, while Rondon desired a trial. Yet both courses ran aground, for the man could not be found. Was it fear, his disappearance, or a plan of further guile? So the search began, and Roosevelt grew sicker all the while. Now they glimpsed with deep unease phantom eyes between the trees, with a piercing gaze that held their lives in deadly jeopardy. Roosevelt, he writhed and rolled in the fever's stranglehold, with a flaming brow declaiming looping lines of poetry. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. In the morning, Teddy woke and seemed himself, his fever broke, but his son was now succumbing to the terrible disease. Kermit strove to block the pain, injected quinine in his vein, and pale and drawn he struggled on. Now their blood commenced to freeze at the sound that met their ears. A man was calling from the trees. It was Julio de Lima begging for a moral schema built on mercy, for he knew he would not make it on his own. "Please," he cried, "for God's sake take me in a boat, do not forsake me." "I regret we can't as yet suspend the survey," said Rondon, curt and icy, and they floated on to leave him all alone. The surveyors estimated still 200 miles awaited to Lieutenant Pyreneus at their chosen rendezvous, knowing not what they would see there, keeping faith that he would be there, fighting doubt but holding out, they paddled on, our rock-ribbed crew, Teddy Roosevelt, Rondon, and their exhausted retinue. But with every mile they gained, bit by bit, the rapids waned. Even this was just enough to hang their ragged hopes upon, till the day the dog Triguero bolted quicker than an arrow, darting thence into the densest vegetation and was gone. Kermit's cry of anguish rang out clear across the Amazon. With a gaze both fierce and misted, Kermit pleaded, nay, insisted that they pause to find his dog, as recent progress had been steady. So Rondon allowed a day, in truth intending to survey, never guessing what a blessing this would be for him and Teddy, for while searching for the hound, they found a tree marked by machete. Rondon identified the sign. They had crossed the borderline to the no-man's land between the deepest jungle and frontier, never drawn by mapper's pen, where there dwelt the rubber men, who would tap for latex sap, and when each crop of trees was clear, camp upriver, search for more, encroaching further every year. Forward cautiously they drifted, till at last all spirits lifted at the sighting of a cottage. Such acute relief they felt as they wound up face to face with an old man named Marquez. He met in shock this filthy flock of river travelers and knelt beside the weakest, who sat up and said, "I'm Teddy Roosevelt." A crackling hearth, a steaming meal. In disbelief that they were real, the men indulged their desperate appetites and toward the table leapt. It had seemed a foolish yen that they would ever come again out of the storm into a warm and cozy home. They danced and wept. Kermit polished off the final bit of scotch that he had kept. As the boatmen ate and drank, Rondon and Teddy sought to thank their benefactor for the bounty, and he took their words with cheer. "Though," he said, "I must inquire, for our homes are under fire in a state of strain with native populations dwelling near. Yet you traveled unconfronted through their lands. How are you here?" But the men could not reply. They didn't know the reason why, never felt how thin the thread from which their safety once had swung. They had kept their steady pace by the Cinta Larga's grace, who had met to gauge the threat, the very eldest to the young, and when arguments were said and done, had found the jury hung. The Cinta Larga had no chieftain. They wholeheartedly believed in group consensus on each matter as a social cornerstone. All decisions were communal, made by general tribunal. While these strangers might pose dangers, they were peaceful and had shown no sign of settling. No verdict reached, the tribe left them alone. Now they raised a mighty toast to the kindness of their host, never guessing at the happenstance by which their lives were spared, and they were indebted then to the rugged rubber men whose stern compassions furnished rations fresh and plentiful. They shared a light canoe, and soon the damaged boats were expertly repaired. 'Twas a stark and welcome change from the river's upper range, for their host agreed to lead them the remainder of the ride, knowing where the river led, when each rapid lay ahead, and how to pass it. Such an asset was this wizened river guide. Thus their pace was hugely quickened, and morale was magnified. 10 days later, they did wind around a river bend to find their Lieutenant Pyreneus, who was waiting on the shore, waving flags from both their nations. With equivalent elations they embraced and felt a taste akin to victory in war, sharing giddily the trials of their travels theretofore. They had braved the waterways for in total 60 days, 500 miles, having made the river's stature manifest. And each man now contemplated the return which soon awaited, being hurled back to the world, reclaiming all that it possessed, the adjourning of their journey and conclusion of their quest. In Manaus, at last they landed, and the company disbanded, having forged a bond of fellowship that would not soon decay. Admiration in their eyes, the leaders made their last goodbyes. These two men would not again come face to face. They sailed away and set a course for New York City on the 7th day of May. Teddy faced a different sort of doubt as soon as he made port, waves of public skepticism of the findings that he claimed. He was forced, still pale and weak, to defend himself and speak to the exactness of each fact upon the map, with voice inflamed, but charisma undiminished, till his critics were ashamed. For the map they'd drawn was true, though Rondon had risked the crew and enforced a pace so careful some considered it a crime. Yet his record of the route was triumphantly borne out by later flights of satellites, cartographically sublime, a geographical achievement that has stood the test of time. Now the Rio Roosevelt, once the River Doubt, has dwelt ever after, slyly snaking through the jungles of Brazil, where nature's appetites erase without a thought all human trace. A cairn of stones, a victim's bones, a tattered tent atop a hill, none remains. Instead, we have to spin the yarn, and so we will. There's more valedictorian to come. Have a drink. We're having an intermission. We'll see you in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Hello? Test, here we go. Okay, wasn't that amazing? Like, can you believe that Weston not only delivered it that well, but wrote the whole damn thing? That was fantastic. Yeah. So now we're going to change gears slightly and we're going to have a little bit of music here from our friend Hank Lemon. I asked Hank to play a little something from the period, which he's going to do, and then, knowing him, he's going to do something else as well, and I think you're going to enjoy both of them. Here he is, Hank Lemon.
A little problem solving and beautiful. Thank you. Great. Well, thanks. It's really, I feel very lucky to be a part of this night. You know, my granddad would quote the cremation of Sam McGee all the time when I was growing up, and I thought that was very cool. And I've got a few good, that's great. Perfect. Thank you. So I got some tunes for you. Dave asked me to be a part of this. He said the era was 1909-ish, and he said we'd love to have a little ragtime tune. He said, could you learn a little bit of Scott Joplin on the mandolin, a wonderful American composer? And I said, sure. So here we go. Here's something by Scott Joplin for you. And I'll play some original tunes after that for you on this little mandolin here. Thank you, thank you. Here we go. So there's a bit of the entertainer for you, and now I'm going to play a couple original tunes I wrote. I thought this next one would be very poignant, as it's just a little poem that I wrote about two siblings that just happen to be twins, identical twins, but they're a little bit different, and they find common ground at the coffee table, at the breakfast table, where you have coffee. This tune is called Sugar and Salt. Sugar and Salt were two twins at birth, and although they both seen plenty of this sweet and salty earth, well, you never would have guessed what with their disparate tastes, that with the help of hot toast, they'd soon share the same plate. See, Sugar had met Toast while Cinnamon was in town, and they'd shared a few drinks, and then when the morning came around, they all met up with coffee at Coffley's freshly made grounds. Coffee said, well, come on in, and they all took a seat. Coffee said, hey, you three, I got some friends that I'd like you to meet. But then when Sugar looked on, he came to a halt. For there, at the table, was his twin sibling, Salt. Salt, Sugar said, a tad louder than he'd thought. Well, what brings you round here near this fine coffee pot? Salt said, Sugar, sweet twin, meat, fried egg, and toast. And then Sugar said, oh yes, Toast and I are close. So you see, although different with their inherent tastes, the twins, Sugar and Salt, shared the same breakfast plate. Thank you. That is on Spotify. If you look up Hank Lemon, you can find that. It's called Sugar and Salt on Spotify. It's only a minute and a half, so if you stream it overnight, I might make $10. That's pretty cool. All right, now the next song here is because the city, I live in Renton, which is just a bit south of here, and the city of Renton asked me to create a tune to be something of a community builder. The library did. The city didn't, the library did. But the city will buy it soon. And this song was forged out of my longing for the sense of community, because the Seattle freeze is only real if you let it be real. So what we need to do is we need to have a moment where we're all going to sing together. So this song that I've written about the city of Renton is going to have a call and response chorus that I hope you sing along with. It's about there's a river that starts in North Bend, Chester Morris Lake, and it runs all the way down to Renton into Lake Washington. It's called the Cider River, and you can walk along the Cider River in Renton, and as my wife and I do very often. So I wrote a song about the Cider River. It's got some educational aspects about cedar trees and what have you, and I hope you'll sing along. It's a call and response, repeat after me song, as we would say at summer camp. So here's a repeat after me song. It's called the Cider River. Well, you can walk all day towards or away the Cascade Cedar River. From Morris Lake it winds and snakes and it ends, I don't think ever. Well, it's miles long, runs cold and strong from North Bend down to Renton. Its eternal wake from lake to lake has taught me this here lesson. Here we go, this is part of it, Rowdy. Cedar River, Cedar River, Cedar Falls, Cedar Falls, Cedar trees, Cedar trees. I've seen them all, of all the other, now just me, mountain rivers I've roamed, yeah. Well, the Cider River is where I call my home. Well, there's a place for you and me underneath that cedar tree, the driest place for one to be 'neath when it rains. Since it rains near every day here 'neath the cedar, I think I'll stay, sing my song and call it home in this refrain. How's it go now? Cedar River, Cedar Falls, Cedar trees, I've seen them all, of all the other mountain rivers I've roamed. Well, the Cider River's where I call my home. It's true. Well, what else? Well, it's a rubber ducky raceway. It's a lucky penny place. They say it's lovely for a stroll from dawn to dusk. Well, it's a place for planes to land, and it's a great place to hold hands. Feel so lucky, we got Big River next to us. One more time. Cedar River, Cedar Falls, Cedar trees, I've seen them all, of all the other mountain rivers I've roamed. Well, the Cider River's where I call my home. Yeah, the Cider River's where I call my home. Thank you.
I think Capital Cider needs to commission him to write a ballad about this place. Good stories, yeah. So actually, before I do my verse, we're going to hear a little bit about the future of Capital Cider. Julie Tall can't be here, but her good friend Sharon here is going to read what Julie wanted you all to hear about the exciting developments.
So I'm going to speak as Julie, who is a tall, willowy, beautiful woman who says, "Hi everyone, thank you all for being here. I'm so disappointed to be missing this wonderful evening. When I read the correspondence between David and Gaylord about performing here, which of course had been written in verse and was highly entertaining, I knew this last event on the stage at Capital Cider in this iteration was going to be special. As you have seen from the posted notices, we are closing on Monday for 2 weeks for an updated look and feel. What the notices do not say is that Capital Cider is bringing on 2 partners, one of whom is a winemaker and the other a chef. So in addition to our dedicated gluten-free kitchen and fabulous selection of ciders, we will have refreshing new talent at the helm of the kitchen and a wonderful wine program including tasting flights. I hope you come back this fall when we reopen. You can keep up with our news via our website and social media, and perhaps you'll just pitch us your next wild and wonderful idea for the stage. Thank you again for being here, and I look forward to seeing you soon, Julie." Now, I'm going to go off script, because somebody's filming this and someday Julie's going to watch this. Cap Cider was an idea born by Julie's son, and for the last 10 years, Julie has turned it into what you're experiencing tonight, a space which without Julie would have just been a cold, empty, damp basement. And with all respect to the artists we've enjoyed, with Julie is a place where community and art is built from nothing. Without her, none of us would be here. And for those of you who know her, as I do, and even those who don't know her as I do, Julie is a person who, in a way that continues to astound me, says yes to love and yes to beauty every time the question is asked of her, and our city is richer for that. So I do encourage you all to come back when Cider becomes its next thing and enjoy the things that Julie has offered for you.
Okay. Here's a true tale to cheer you, from Roosevelt's era, of a fellow who never stood still. A gambler, a talker, above all a walker, a pedestrian, if you will. But a pedestrian king, if there is such a thing, for at walking he had no peer. He won long-distance races in all kinds of places, a steam engine on legs, so I hear. A walking race? That's a rather dull thing for us with so much distraction. But the 19th century had no TikTok or tweets. Edward Weston was the attraction. People would come from cities and towns to marvel at young Weston. Walk 6 days straight, night and day, round a track, doing 500 miles before resting. Turned out like a dandy in bow tie and ruffles, or a velvet suit, bowler and sash, Weston was always the star of the show, winning races while cutting a dash. And no one before him had made walking their business, and perhaps no one has since his time. He sold postcards, pamphlets, timetables and tickets to shows where he'd march and opine. They gave him a name that cemented his fame, understated perhaps, but it stuck all the same. Weston the Pedestrian, they called him back then, and his feats inspired me to pick up my pen. Being freshly retired and decently fit, I like to pretend that I still have that it. I go on my runs and I climb all those hills and attend to my miles much more than my bills. But when my legs are hurting and I feel a bit racked, I rally myself with one blessed fact. Weston's great walk came not in his prime, but when he was 70 in 1909. Picture this. Edward Weston, dapper as ever, surveyed the growing throng. They'd come to see him one last time, that crowd 10,000 strong. They'd come to New York's old post office to wish him on his way. He'd bet he could walk to San Francisco in only 100 days. The savvy old gent knew the appeal of the 100-day claim he was staking. Newspapers lined up for exclusive dispatches of the progress each week he'd be making, and gamblers too were paying attention. The brave ones bet he'd win out, but most of them doubted the 100-day claim, and the odds reflected that doubt. It was a bit after 4 on a late winter's day when Weston started his walk. He made Yonkers by 9 and dined with the mayor, then fronted a crowd who demanded a talk. He lectured on diet, a firm bed at night, the French marching style, and muscles too tight. He regaled them with stories of feats by the score. then bade them adieu and walked out the door. He trudged until 1 in the morning that night, frost on the turnpike reflecting moonlight. 30 miles due north he'd made on day one, but west across the land he'd not even begun. Now it's 3,000 miles across this big land if you walk on a line mostly taut, but Weston's route needed 4,000 miles through towns that would pay for his thoughts. So 40 miles a day was required, and a speech most night for his pains. North for 6 days to Albany, then west for his run to the plains. Across upstate New York, the crowds lined the streets. They'd known him from earlier fame. Some 40 years back, he'd made 10,000 bucks walking fast to Chicago from Maine. Through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana he barreled, into blizzards that were not in the plan. His crew in a newfangled automobile that broke down more than it ran. Walking by day and speaking by night, he managed to pick up the pace. He was met in Chicago by 10,000 fans 5 weeks after starting the race. Ahead of his schedule, 1,200 miles in, the roads seemed less muddy and the weather less grim. He loudly proclaimed that he would win the prize. Ahead were the prairies, flat roads and May skies. Now fortune's a river that rarely runs straight, and old men should know it's not wise to tempt fate. Nearly 3,000 miles remained in his trip, a chasm unseen twixt the cup and the lip. He relaxed for a day, bulking up with a feast, penning glowing updates to the papers back east, repeating his boast that he'd finish in leisure. The man was naive of Midwestern spring weather. Moving out of Chicago, the rain fell in sheets, the cornfields were flooded and the roads ran knee-deep. The car bogged so badly that it sat for 2 days, and his walking slowed down to a funeral parade. He lost all his cushion in 1 dreadful week. A change was required, or the outlook was bleak. County roads were his bane with their floods monumental. But the railways were raised and transcontinental. If you've walked on a rail bed, you'll know what it's like. Your legs never settle on a stride that feels right. The gravel's too soft and the ties make you pay, and trains seem to think that they have right of way. It wasn't too bad on the wide open plains. He walked on the rail bed, his crew rode the trains. They travelled in comfort from station to station, securing his lodgings and crowds for the oration. Progress was steady and sure, if not fast, but in western Missouri he hit an impasse. The great river Missouri was spanned at that spot by a narrow rail bridge with no place to pull off. More than a mile long and 100 feet high, the odds were not good should a train rumble by. There were no other crossings for miles south or north. He needed a schedule before he set forth. A cheerful young local was keen to help out. After the next one, there's 15 minutes about. About, cried Weston, he needed precision. But gone was the kid. Weston faced his decision. Through the gaps between the ties, he could see only air, and the muddy brown river returning his stare. He paused for a moment, straining to hear any sound of a train, and then swung into gear. Weston's river of fortune flowed smooth on that morn. He reached the far shore ere the sound of a horn, but the memory lodged in his dreams for a spell, a train or a river to sweep him to hell. Across western Missouri and then into Kansas he marched with unflagging stride. The headwinds were strong and the towns far apart. Long gone were the crowds by his side. Some days were scorching and some nearly freezing, always the wind in his face. Some days fair skies, but some days tornadoes that hunkered him down in one place. But by the last week of May, he landed upon the bustling burg of Denver, the greatest city of those wide open plains that welcomed him in splendor. And the Denver Post had organized grand fireworks for his arrival. Perched on a balcony above the crowds, he made light of his survival. But just as his talk was winding up, he brought it to an end. "Forgive me, friends, I must attend to my progress for today. There's 20 more miles before I'm done, though it pains me not to stay." It was not just the calendar that pushed him along, though that hurry was hard to deny. What he saw when he looked to the west chilled his blood, those mountains that reached to the sky. Yes, the steepest peaks of the ragged Rockies now blocked him to the west. So north to Wyoming, 100 miles, just to find a crossable crest. Towns had been sparse in Colorado, but Wyoming set him aghast. One day he had to walk 36 miles before he could break his fast. But then he hit, near Rawlin, Wyoming, the Continental Divide. "It's downhill from here," he said to himself, and a bounce returned to his stride. Well, water wends its way downhill, but a man isn't river or rain. 1,000 miles were still to go. Only 20 short days yet remained. Maintaining that mileage through these harsh lands filled him with dread and dismay. From here, every day would mean 50 miles. A cruel price his old body must pay. 200 miles later, a temporary reprieve, for like the Mormons before him, he found Utah, an Eden of grasses and streams that welcomed the weary pilgrim. Now Brigham Young and his Mormon train by the Great Salt Lake came to rest. But Weston just cursed this inland sea that now blocked his path to the west. Abroad on the streets of orderly Ogden, he again sought local advice. Which way should he go round this big briny sea? Either way might add days to his plight. At last he located a knowledgeable local with a grin and a voice that did falter. "If going around it's too far for your liking, you could always just walk on the water." A snort in retort was all he could muster, but indeed no detour was needed. A 12-mile rail trestle crossed the water with ease for 2 trains to go by unimpeded. The day he left Ogden and trod on that trestle was a day he'd not quickly forget. He made 72 miles before he retired. Perhaps he would triumph yet. And the railway company had made him an offer that filled him with bravado. They'd provide a man and a velocipede to help through the worst of Nevada. In case you're wondering, a velocipede was a gas-powered rig designed for checking the track. But this one carried food, water and ice, a movable feast at his back. Now the worst of Nevada was a fearsome place. Sandstorms that pummeled him raw, days so hot he walked only at night, and the darkness then slowing him more. Through basins and ranges no respite was found, and the miles came ever too few. The closer he got to the snowy Sierra, the greater his deficit grew. As far as we know, Weston kept no journal, and his dispatches were ever upbeat, so we'll have to imagine the pain he felt when the math finally signalled defeat. The truth seemed to hit in Lovelock, Nevada, just 300 miles from his goal. He would not set foot on the Golden Gate on the day he'd so often foretold. A lesser man might have stopped right there. Not Weston, as ever unbowed. The old man gave word that he'd finish his walk at a pace that conditions allow. Up through the Sierras, down past Sacramento, the conditions allowed a fair pace. Released from the clock and done with the rails, a smile returned to his face. And crowds, growing crowds around him each day. They knew they'd not see this again. That someone so old had done something so bold was almost too much to explain. And somehow his fate of just missing his date made it all the more poignant and true, for the lines in his face and the strain in his gait gave a sense of the hell he'd been through. On day 104, from Oakland's Long Pier, he crossed Frisco Bay in a boat. Precise to the end, he'd walked 3 extra miles to make up for the distance afloat. Standing erect at the bow of the ship, like Washington crossing the Delaware, they saw him coming from Telegraph Hill and fireworks burst in midair. They wanted to carry him on their shoulders to his hotel a mile from the pier. But the dapper old gent politely demurred, "I think I can make it from here." The news went out across the wide land. The president sent his compliment. Calendar be damned, not quite as planned, but Weston had walked the continent. That should have been that. That should have been that. The beloved old chap should have been justly contented. Others before him had claimed such a walk, but never so well documented. And the papers moved on, for while he'd been gone, Robert Peary had reached the North Pole. An age of exploration was opening up that made Weston's brave march seem a stroll. But to one old man, there remained the matter of the 100 days not met. That his final walk should fall just short consumed him with regret. Of course, stories like mine, long-winded and rhymed, delight in great heroes who fail. Who now would know of the Mudville 9 had Casey somehow prevailed? But a life fully lived is more than a ballad. And who says when the story must end? A man or a woman can grasp their own fate. True lives contain twists that transcend. Back in New York, he carefully reviewed just where the time had gone. The harsh high plains, the long detours, and always the headwinds strong. And quietly, the very next spring, he rode the railways west, walking eastbound from Los Angeles. He moved like a man possessed. I'll spare you the shorter route he took, but the wind was at his back, the weather held, and the miles flew by. He was on the inside track. Soon enough, the press took note, reporting a preposterous boast. I'll wrap this up before summer hits. 90 days at most. Tempting the fates by listing his dates, he then published a day-by-day plan. After so much boasting throughout his career, few now believed the old man. But this time, somehow, his word was good. He crushed his 90-day plan, met back in New York on day 79 by 250,000 fans. Weston lived another 20 years,
Whoa.
drawing crowds into his 80s, walking through towns and doffing his caps to the gentlemen and ladies. Yes, Weston's age was another time. We think we're so busy today. We drive in our cars and tap on our phones and fritter our time away. But I like to think the pedestrian might be tramping out there still, showing you can do damn near anything with enough vision, pluck, and will. Thank you.